it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using the Tiny Towny Allie Loves Ice Cream stamp by Stamping Bella. This is a blue rubber stamp and it's mounted on some cling foam. I'll take it out of the package to show you guys, just in case you haven't used one of these in a while. It's been a little while for me. And the cling foam is not sticky at all to the touch, but it does cling very well to your acrylic block or your Misty or whatever you're using to stamp it with. So I have stamped that on some Catherine Pooler Favorite White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink, and I'm going to be coloring with my Copic markers to match some paper from the Cartabella That's My Girl 6x6 pad. So I'm going to tear out the sheet that I want to use as my palette inspiration and tuck that under the panel. So I'm starting with my background, and I'm going to attempt something that I have never done before. I've done cloudy backgrounds before, but I've never actually drawn the clouds in myself. And I just decided to give it a go today, and I'm going to wing it and see how it goes. So I am starting with a very, very pale gray marker. I'm using C0, and I'm going to sketch my cloud shapes in with that. And I'm just making them kind of scalloped up on the bottom side and then a little bit rounded at the top. So I am going to do several of these. I will be cutting down this background, so I'm not worrying about going all the way to the edges, but mainly just centering them around this little girl and her stack of ice cream. And I'm trying to make sure that they all have a similar look to them, but that they don't look exactly the same. So I'm just making them a little bit more elongated at some ends and putting a larger top on the left on some of them and larger on the right on some of them. And as I get down toward the horizon line, I'm making them a little bit smaller and skinnier, just for that bit of perspective. Then I'm going to take the C1 and start to darken that up and really give them some more shape so that I can see that more clearly. I can make any adjustments now as needed. Since the lighter shade is so pale, I can basically just color right over it. So I'm basically just defining those edges. And honestly, this was so much easier than I thought it would be to do. I was a little bit nervous to attempt this and thought maybe I should do like a practice run, but if you know, I've been dealing with a neck injury and I've been trying to simplify my videos and take less time filming them. So I just decided to jump right in, and I'm really pleased with how it turned out. I think it was pretty effective, and I would definitely give this a try again in the future. So now that I have my clouds defined, I'm going to do that a little bit more, especially on the underside with the C3 marker. But I will also add a few little flicks of that C3 on the top part as well, just to accentuate the curves and give it a little bit more body and shape. So I'll just finish up with these last few clouds, and I'll use a little less of the C3 down there because I don't want them to look too heavy since they are thinner. And then I will switch to my C1 again, and I'm going to blend over the edge of that C3 to just soften that up, make the clouds look a little bit more dreamy and give them a bit more of a stronger shadow down at the bottom. Just give them a bit more prominence on the page, especially since we still have to add our sky colors. And then I'll switch to the C0 and repeat that process, just blending over the edge of the C1, not filling in the clouds by any means. I still want to leave plenty of white space so that they look white. I just want them to be really nice and vibrant and defined. Then I'm going to switch to my sky colors. I'm going to use BG Quadruple Zero, BG 000 and BG 01. I'm going to start with my lightest shade, that BG 000, and just start to block in my sky. You can see that I'm holding my marker almost sideways and using the side of that nib so I can get a large wash of color and just lay that down really quickly. I'm going to go carefully around her legs, in between her legs, and then work on the right hand side. And I'm only taking it down to just above her ankle because the rest of that is going to be grass, which I'll do later on. Then I'll come in with my BG 000 and add some extra definition on the underside of those clouds. This is really going to help them pop forward and just make them have a bit more prominence. And so I will add that right around the curves that I want to accentuate as well. And definitely behind the girl, I want to have some of that more vivid blue. It's still very pale, but that little extra bit of blue in there does really make a difference and starts to make that sky really come together. I'll add some of that between her legs, and then I'll come in with that BG01. And this one I'm going to be super sparing with. I'm just going to mainly add that to the bottom of the clouds and then into the deepest creases at the top of the clouds, and just draw a little bit of extra emphasis to those. And then once I have that laid in, I'm going to go back to my other two shades and just blend that back out. So I'm using the BG 000 next, just working my way back down in the reverse, blending that out, again holding that marker kind of sideways and using the long part of the nib rather than just the tip. And then I'll come in with that BG 000 and just blend that out so that we have a nice smooth background. Now I did notice that the blues in the sky were much more vivid than the blues in that pattern paper. So I am going to try to knock that back a bit. I'm going to take the BG 70, which is a barely there shade. I often use it for like fairy wings or glass jars, things like that, as it's super, super pale, but it is a bit more desaturated than the other BG shades that I was using. So I'm just adding that right over top. Now I'm finally ready to start coloring in this sweet little towny girl. And so I am going to start with her skin. I'm using E00, E11, and E13. Since this is a summer card, I wanted her to have a little bit of a tan. So I'm taking that E13 and adding some shadow up under her hairline. I'll also place it on her neck and on the back of her arms. I'm going to add a little bit of a shadow on her legs right up under her shorts, and then I'll take that down the outside edge of her legs and add that to her little foot as well. I did miss that her belly is showing, so I'll have to come back and color that later on. I didn't realize it until I was thinking about what color I might want to color her shirt and realized there was a little bit of exposed skin there. So I'll come back and get that in a little bit later. Then I'm going to take the E11 and just go over the edge of that E13, softening that up a bit, but still saving some room for a nice highlight. You can see that I've switched the grip on my marker so that I'm holding it more up and down and just using the very tip of that nib so that I can get into all those skinny little areas. And then I'll bring in that E00, fill in the bottom of her face and her ear, and then add a nice little highlight to the top of her arms and the inner part of her legs. And of course her little toes that we see in her flip-flops. I'm going to give her some rosy cheeks using R11, R20, and R22, just adding a little oval of that R22 first, then blending around the edges of that with the R20, and then the R11 to soften that into her skin tone. And then while I have those shades out, I'm also going to do one of her scoops of ice cream. So I'm just deciding on which one I want to be pink. And then I will add that R22 down to the bottom edge and then kind of up the right hand side. And then I will blend that out with the R20 and then the R11. Then I'll move on to her hair, and I wanted her to be kind of like a dark blonde, light brown. So I'm using E50, E51, E53, and E55. I'll start with the E55 and map out where my darkest shades are eventually going to go. I put those in the part of her hair and on the ends and the little parts that are being folded into the braid. And then I start to darken that up with the next shade, the E51, just bringing in some extra color, eating into a little bit more of that white space. Then I use the E53, and now I'm coming in with the E55, doing nice little flicking motions so that we get little tapered ends to each of those strokes. And then once I have those all laid in, I'll work my way back down into the reverse, eating up more and more of that white space until it eventually just becomes a nice pale blonde highlight. So I'm using that E51, and then I'll come in with the E50. And then I wanted to have just a little bit more contrast in there, so I'm going to bring in the E57, and I'm just going to add a few little extra flicks of that. I feel like it really does make a huge difference to have those low lights in there. So I'll just flick that in from the part and from the ends and add a little bit into the braid as well. I'll blend that back out with a little bit of the E55, just a few quick little strokes there. And now you can see that it's really starting to come together and look a little bit more vibrant and realistic. And then I'll just go back in with that E50 and just color over the highlight areas once again so that everything is integrated well together. I noticed that I missed a little chunk of hair right behind her head, her shoulder area, so I just went back and colored that in. And then I'm going to do her ice cream cone, starting with the E55, blending out with the E53, and then using the E51 for the highlight. Then I'm going to go back to her little belly because I just noticed that I missed it. And I'm using the same shades, just adding that E13 to the outer edges and only adding a tiny little bit of highlight because the light wouldn't really be hitting that area. It would be in more shadow. I'm going to move on to her little jean shorts, or I guess they don't have to be jean, they could be another material, but I'm going to color those in a dark blue-green shade. So I'm using BG72, BG75, and BG78. So if you remember, I added that BG70 over the sky, so these are going to tie right in with that. I added the BG78 to the shadows, and then I'm blending out with the BG75. I'm also creating the cuffs to be just a little bit lighter, so I only use the BG75 for the highlight on those. Then I'm filling in with the BG72 and just making sure to go over the edges so that everything is nice and smooth, and then filling in the cuffs. And I felt like the definition wasn't quite what I wanted on the main part of the short, so I just went back to that BG75 and added a little extra of that mid-tone and then blended back out with the BG72. For her top, I wanted to go with a sunshine yellow, so I used Y11, Y21, and Y26, starting with the Y26 for the shadow, putting that along the back of her arm and the back of her shirt, blending out with the Y21, and then filling in with the Y11. I also wanted some lemon sorbet ice cream in her little stack, so I kept the Y11 and added Y000 and Y000, And I am going to do another little scoop in this stack. I love lemon anything, so I had to include that, especially since we have so much yellow in that pattern paper. And then between those two, I'm going to do an orange sherbet because that's another flavor that I love, and we have a little bit of an orange in that mix in the pattern paper as well. So we've got kind of a rainbow theme going on here, but not quite exactly. But yeah, I thought that would be a fun flavor combo for her. The next scoop is of course going to be my most favorite flavor of all, which is mint chocolate chip. So I'm using G quadruple zero, G00, and G02. And then I'll bring in E41, E47, and E49. And I'm going to do a chocolate scoop down at the bottom, because if I ever have a choice of two flavors, I always pick mint chocolate chip and chocolate, especially if the chocolate has something in it like chocolate chips or nuts or any kind of little add-in. That's my favorite. So I colored in that bottom scoop, and then I'm also going to add some chocolate chips to the mint chocolate chip ice cream with that E47 and the E44, just adding some irregular shaped little spots in there. I'm also going to do her flip-flops with these shades, so I'm adding a little bit of shadow to the outside edges, heavier on the outside to match the shading on her legs, and then I'm going to blend out with the E47 and fill in with that E44, again using the very tip of my marker to get into those small little areas. And then I'm going to do a coffee flavored ice cream. So I kept the E44 and added in E42 and E43, and I did the top scoop for that. And then of course coffee ice cream needs to have some little chocolate chips in there as well. So I added some little spots to that, and I went darker with the E47. So we've got just one scoop to go, and I decided to go for a strawberry. I'm imagining that the one on top of the chocolate is maybe cherry. So I'm doing strawberry between the coffee and the mint chocolate chip, and then cherry between the orange sherbet and the chocolate. So I added some little cherry pieces in there with the R24 and the R29. And now I'm ready to work on the grass. I'm going to use G40, G43, and G46. And then I also brought in G20 because it's such a pale shade. So I'm starting with that G20 and flicking in some color, just coloring carefully around her legs so I don't drag any of that color out. And again, I'm using the side of my marker so that I get a nice wide swath of color. I'm just filling that in, taking that down to the bottom of the panel. And then I'll come in with the next shade, which is going to be the G40, and I'll just add some more definition to that horizon line. And I'm also just going to add a few little swaths of color here and there, kind of just picking areas to have a little bit more shadow, especially where she's standing around her legs and feet. Then I'll bring in the G43 and just continue that, adding a little bit less of that darker shade just to have it in a few little places. And like I said, especially around her feet and at the horizon line, but also just adding a few little flicks here and there to make it look a little bit more natural and like the ground is a little bit rolling and not just completely flat. And then I'll blend that back out with the G40. And again, I'm not taking that all the way to the edges because I know I'm going to be cutting that off. So I just need to take it down to the bottom of the panel because I will be using the whole top to bottom, just not the sides. Once I have everything blended out how I like it, I'm going to go back in and add some grasses with that G46. And I'm just going to do tiny little flicks of blades of grass here and there. I'll do 2 in some places and 3 in others. Sometimes I'll do 2 and then do 1 that's a little bit further away, just trying to make it look natural. And I'm making them a little bit thicker closest to her feet, because that's kind of like where the viewer is, and then smaller as we get back toward the horizon line. And I also added in a few with that G43, just so we have a varying shade of green in there. And then I am going to grab a black Sakura Jelly Roll pen and get that going off to the side so that it's flowing nicely. And I'll go over her eyes to make those bright and shiny. And now I am ready to trim this panel down. I'm using the second largest of the Lawn Fawn large mini slimline stackables. And I'm going to figure out where I want that placed. And then I'm going to tape that down with some Post-it tape and run that through my die cutting machine. And then when I remove it, I will have some nice stitching detail along the outside edges, which just make it look a bit more polished. Honestly, this would also make a great bookmark in that size, but for today it's going to be a focal panel. So I'm going back to that Cartabella, That's My Girl 6x6 pad, and flipping through until I find a corresponding print to use with the initial one that I pulled out for my color palette. And I really liked this pink. It was the last sheet of it, but the little fleck in there just reminds me of strawberry ice cream. So I decided to go with that one. It was just too perfect not to use on this card. I'll lift that up so you can see that little fleck a little bit better. And then I'm going to trim those down with my paper trimmer. For my sentiment, I am going to remove my grip mat from my MISTI to make room for those stamps since they have that foam on the back. And I'm going to pop another piece of pattern paper from that paper pad into my MISTI. I also added another little scrap of cardstock underneath just to act as a bit of cushion. And then I will close the door of my MISTI to pick up that sentiment. I'm going to stamp it using VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and I'm going to stamp it down twice to make sure it is nice and bold. The sentiment says, "Hello Sunshine," which I think is a great kind of universal sentiment for the summertime. So I'll trim that down. In the meantime, I'm going to pop my card base in my MISTI. I'm using Lawn Fawn Ballet Slippers cardstock, and I'm going to arrange my stamps there. I have a sentiment that I want to use on the inside. And then for my image, I'm just going to use the same image from the front, but I'm going to stamp it off the left bottom corner just to give it a little bit of a different look. I'm stamping that in Lawn Fawn bubblegum ink and just pressing that down. And I'm going to stamp it a few times to make sure that I have a good impression. And the sentiment on the inside side says, "Brighter days are on the way," which I think goes great with the outside. I'm ready to start assembling, so I'm going to take that heart print and I'm going to glue that down to cover the entire card front. It is an A2 standard size card, so it's 4 1/4 wide by 5 1/2 tall. And I'm going to just press on the corners to make sure that it's on there nice and straight. And then I will add this little pink fleck down toward the left side. I'm going to leave a little bit of that heart print showing through and then just have that toward the left. And then I'll take my little girl and I'm going to peel off the release papers from the foam tape that I added to the back, line that up in the center of that pink strip and pop that down into place. Then I'll bring in my sentiment. I trim that down with the second largest of the Lawn Fawn Everyday Sentiment banners. And I'm just going to figure out where I want it on my card. And I decided right there at the horizon line was the perfect place. I do have to pop up a little bit of it on foam tape so that it is on the same level as the focal panel. So I just trimmed down a piece to be a little bit thinner. and I'm figuring out where I need to place that on my card. I'll pop that directly on my card. I just figured that was the easiest way to adhere it. And then I'll add a little bit of liquid glue to the end of the flag where it's going to overlap onto my focal panel. So I'll get that in place, and then I'll just flip the card over to the back and trim off the excess. And I didn't get it quite straight, so I just trimmed off that once again. And then of course I need to add a little bit of glitter to this card, so I'm going to take some Stardust Stickles and just add it to the right side of each of my ice cream scoops. I think that also gives them a nice little bit of a frosty look. And that is going to finish this one off for today, so I'll lift that up so you can see it in a bit more detail, hopefully catch some of that sparkle and shine, and of course give you another look at the inside. I had so much fun stamping and coloring this adorable little girl from Stamping Bella today. I hope you guys enjoyed it too. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and leave me a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell if you want to be alerted when I post new videos. All the products I used will be listed and linked in the description bar below in case you'd like to pick up anything for yourself. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. Thanks so much for spending your time with me today. I hope you had a good one, and I'll see you soon in the next. Bye-bye.